First, let's go back to 2008, after the conventions, to November. In the United States, that historic moment when Barack Obama was elected president. I mean, it was truly historic. The first African-American president in the United States in a land with a legacy of slavery. Truly amazing. I think the world heaved a sigh of relief on that day. And I think that was people across the political spectrum everywhere. I mean, this is the man who had spoken against war, right, who was criticizing the Iraq War, which we were in the midst of, who represented so much different on every level. And the question is, though, what has happened in this 2 years? And I think it's instructive for all of us when what you dare to possibly dream actually happens. It was people of every political stripe, every movement, who worked together to make that kind of difference. And it was also amazing because here you had, Barack Obama was a community organizer before he was senator. He organized on the south side of Chicago, especially around issues of housing. So the community organizer-in-chief became the commander-in-chief. I mean, the good thing is now parents all over the world can say to their kids, maybe you could be a community organizer too. But what does that mean? He's now the commander-in-chief. And all of the community organizing that was done that he so successfully led, who then takes it on? Very quickly after he was elected, the right-wing backlash was intense. And it destabilized all of the movements that had so much passion and energy. This is not about one person when you have an election like this. Sure, that person occupies the most powerful office on earth. But there is a force more powerful. And it is all of you in this room and everywhere, through Canada, through the United States, and through the world. That is the force that is more powerful. And when a moment like that takes place, the work that has to be done actually increases. Because it's only the opening of a door, ever so slightly, it's an opportunity. And that door can be slammed shut very quickly. Just think when President Obama is in the White House and those that are used to having having the ear of the most powerful person on earth are whispering into his ear, if he can't point out the window of the Oval Office and say, if I do that, they will storm the Bastille. If there's no one out there, he's in big trouble. And people may completely disagree with Barack Obama on so many different levels, right? One of the first acts, very brave, when he was inaugurated was to say he was closing Guantanamo. Well, this is more than a year later. And the WikiLeaks documents are now out on Guantanamo, and it isn't closed, and clearly well over 100 men have been held there who are entirely innocent. And there is Barack Obama talking about military tribunals, all that Bush was talking about. If you didn't see the face or know the year, if you were just reading the transcript, sometimes it would be hard to know the difference. So where do movements come into play? I think it's really instructive to look at history. And that's, one of our tasks at Democracy Now! It's actually now broadcasting on over 900 stations. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary. We began in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting in the United States, and only a few dozen community radio stations thought it would end with the election of President Clinton because we were just an election show, showing what people were doing from state to state around the elections. I was hosting, and it was interesting that I was chosen to host this because I perhaps was less interested, you could say, in that time in electoral politics because most people weren't voting. But that's why it was important to do the show. Well, I didn't think people were apathetic, just what were they doing? Because I thought people were engaged, as people are in their communities. And I think that's the most interesting thing to document, because when you can tap that, and that connects with electoral politics, you can change the world. And so we did this show, but there was more of a demand for it after the election than before. And so it started to grow, and then the week of September 11th, 2001, just completely coincidentally, we were starting on television, and it just took off like wildfire. One TV station would take it, then the radio station in that town would ask for it, and it would go like that through the country until, well, more than 900 stations, and it's broadcasting throughout Canada and community and college stations, throughout Europe and Asia and South Africa, Sweden, television and radio throughout Latin America. We translate our headlines into Spanish. Over 300 stations are just running the headlines in Spanish, because there is a need, a hunger for independent media, because there's a hunger for that dialogue with independent voices all over the country and all over the world. I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded after World War II in 1949 by a war resistor named Lou Hill. He came out of the detention camps and said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations, as George Gerbner, the former dean at the Annenberg School of Communications at University of Pennsylvania, said, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. And so Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley, 1949, then KPFK in Los Angeles in 59, my station, WBAI in New York, 1960, WPFW in Washington, and KPFT in Houston went on the air in 1970, and that's an interesting station. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It was 1970, the spring of 1970. They went on the air, and the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter within the first weeks of operation and blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet and rebuilt their transmitter, the Klan blew it up again. I mean, the silver lining was, it's not as if they had money for advertising. It certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. I think the second time the station blew up as Guthrie was singing Alice's Restaurant. I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, but of the Ku Klux Klan, but he said, I often confuse their titles. He said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an aunt in Afghanistan, an uncle in Iraq, it changes your world. It breaks down stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. It's a critical way to connect the dots, to begin the dialogue. It makes it harder to want to hurt someone if you know something about them and you say, it sounds like my bubba, or it sounds like my baby. This catastrophe that's unfolding in Japan right now, with the nuclear catastrophe, the tsunami, it's horrifying to see what's happening to Japan, because it brings us back to the dawn of the nuclear age, which was the end of World War II. And when I talk about knowing a place or a person makes you less likely to want to harm it, I think back to the U.S. Secretary of War. They were called Secretaries of War at the time. Now they're called Defense Secretaries. But then it was the Secretary of War Stimson, World War II. And he was handed the target list in Japan of the possible cities to drop the nuclear bomb on. And Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto was among the cities. And he crossed Kyoto off the list because he said he and his wife had visited Kyoto. It was such a beautiful city. He knew its landmarks. He knew its people. I mean, think about how profound that is. If only the people of Hiroshima had been so lucky as to host Secretary Stimson and his wife, or the people of Nagasaki. To know is to begin to understand, and maybe even to want to protect. It also brings me back to that time to tell a story of independent journalist named Wilfred Burchett. He was Australian. The U.S. had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. General MacArthur had put all of southern Japan off limits to the press, and most of them had gone off to the ship off the coast to cover the surrender of the Japanese. But Wilfred Burchett alone took a train for 30 hours to Hiroshima because he wanted to see with his own eyes what had taken place, because we had entered a new era. This was the dawn of the nuclear age. When he arrived in Hiroshima, he saw this moonscape. He had covered many wars. He had never seen anything like this. The shadows of people ingrained in walls, people running with their skin melting off. He didn't have a language to describe it. He talked about the atomic plague. And he sat down with his Hermes typewriter in the rubble, and he tapped out the words, "I write this as a warning to the world." This was a report that rocked the War Department. They had to answer it. He talked about this atomic plague and radiation sickness. They said it was Japanese propaganda. And so they set their own stenographers to tell a different story, like William Lawrence. He was writing for the New York Times. Oh, he was also on the payroll of the Pentagon, of the War Department. He was writing the press releases for Stimson. If you were a New York Times reader, you might not know this. But he was on the payroll of the War Department, and he was also writing for the New York Times. The Times put out pieces, "No Radiation Sickness Found at Hiroshima," and Lawrence did a 10-part series on Hiroshima, extolling the virtues of the atomic plague and describing the nuclear mushroom as something magnificent that man had never seen before. He won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. I speak at the journalism school at Columbia every year. I was just there a few weeks ago, but a few years ago I went up there because it houses the Pulitzer Center, and I went to petition them to strip the New York Times of their Pulitzer for their coverage of the dawn of the nuclear age, for, well, what you might call the first embedded reporter. And you think about the nuclear age from then until now and what Japan is suffering through today. It's our job to show the images, and it also